presentation today is by Brent Okeson, and we're really excited to have Brent present today on the subject of creating effective training programs. Brent does an awesome job here with us, and we're excited to hear this presentation. Good to go, Brent?
Yeah, good to go. Hello, everybody. Like Jason mentioned, there's a lot of things we do with training, and sometimes we get a lot of questions about what training is required and how often do I need to do training and things like that. So we thought let's do a webinar on that. Let's address those today. So that's the goal, the things we want to talk about. We want to talk about what are the trainings that are required. We're going to help identify those things. We're going to talk about who should be doing the training, who should take the training, who should be involved in that. Also, how often do you want to do it? How to deliver it? Who should be the one to deliver that, and the different methods of delivering trainings, the frequency, and also documentation. The best way to keep documentation to show that you're doing the training and to be able to track things and have an effective program with that. So that's really the overview of today's webinar that we want to talk about. And hopefully this will help you in your workplace to learn about some other required trainings and then how you can better track those things and keep a schedule on that. So that's the goal. So when it comes to training, there's some training that's required, and especially when it comes to OSHA and safety training, there's some things that you need to provide training for to be in compliance. Some of the words that are used oftentimes are required training, and sometimes they're recommended. And so we're going to distinguish between the two of those today. Which ones are required based on the job task? Sometimes they're very specific to the task that's being done, and then we'll talk about some that we recommend on a frequency that you do there at your organizations. But we'll look at OSHA standards because there are some that are very specific. They have some specific training requirements in individual standards, and I will help highlight some of those today and talk about those topics of things that you definitely need to be training on. And then we'll talk about methods of training and then also retraining. Sometimes there are annual refreshers, and there's a certain frequency of some that you need to provide retraining on certain topics, and we'll help highlight those today as we go through this. So who should be doing the training? OSHA uses a couple of words in their standards, and one is qualified and one is competent. So a qualified person should be the person that's doing your training. What OSHA calls a qualified person is somebody that has knowledge and understanding of the topic and experience that they can adequately train those employees with the skills and knowledge that they have. And the other term that OSHA uses is a competent person. Sometimes there's a competent person required based on the task that's going on, such as in excavation work, there is a requirement that there's a competent person on the job site, and OSHA requires that competent person be trained. So when you're looking at training, who should be doing it, it kind of depends on the standards, but you definitely always need to have somebody that's qualified, knowledgeable, and having skills and experience to train your employees in the right way, that they understand these things, the standards, the policies and procedures, the things that are needed to keep the employees safe. So there's lots of different methods. There's online training, there's webinars, there's in-person trainings, online seminars are another option, hands-on training. Sometimes it's very specific to a type of equipment being used or a demonstration that's needed to understand a procedure. So it could be an in-person and hands-on training. And some of the standards that OSHA has identify that the training needs to be understandable to the employee. And what that means is if you have an employee that speaks a different language, then it's the employer's responsibility to train in that language so that it's understandable to the employee. I know the respiratory protection standard says it that way, and there's others as well. So those are things to think about. What is the training that your employees need? Who should be doing it? Who is qualified and capable of doing that in a good, effective way? And then what are the different types, whether it's in person or online or hands-on training? Those are all things to think about. When it comes to frequency, it does depend on the topic. Like I said, there are some OSHA standards that specify specific requirements and frequency, and we'll talk about some of those. Some just need an initial training, so it could be a one-time to be compliant with those requirements. It could be a one-time, and then some need annual refreshers or certain frequency of training to keep everybody up to speed on those things there. You also want to look at your organization itself. Maybe there's other trainings that are needed based on the type of work that you do. There could be other risks. So you want to take a look at the trends and see, well, what is causing accidents? What is happening at our organization? What training do we need to address to keep our accidents down? I recommend taking a look at your accidents and your frequency of certain accidents to see what might benefit you there. And you can customize your training plan to addressing those trends. So look at accidents, injuries, look at anything that's high risk. If you have high risk operations, high risk tasks, or dangerous things that employees are working around, you're definitely going to want to address those training needs there. So look at your staff, look at your training, look at your organization, identify what you need, and then identify a schedule for it, how often you would need to train on those different topics. One of the best ways to track trainings and maintain a schedule is to use what's called a training matrix. And I'll show you an example of this in just a minute. But what it does is it helps you identify the frequency of these trainings and how often you need to do that. And you can keep track on this matrix of when the last training was done and when it's due again. You can track this by position, by department, or by employee to make sure that everybody's keeping up with the trainings that they need. So here's an example of what a training matrix might look like. This is just one example that we have. And you can make up your own. They have them online. There's many examples out there, but it's a basic spreadsheet with cells that you can track. So across the top horizontally, you can see the different types of trainings, and you could identify the frequency in there. And then the column on the far left going down, you can see the different job titles or departments. And you can just check this box off to see and identify, who needs that training and how often they need to do that. But that's something that can help you and your organization to maintain that schedule, to keep everybody current on the trainings they need and track all of that for the frequency. So that's something you might think about that you might want to use there in your workplace. Documentation is another big thing. There's many ways to keep it, and we recommend that you do keep the documentation. So any roster that you have from any training, we always recommend you keep that. It could be a sign-in sheet, it could be a printout, could be any way that there's a roster, but keep documentation there. You want to have down who did the training, what the dates were, the topic, who attended. That's all good information to keep. You can also do this electronically. So it could be copies of rosters that you scanned in and keep electronically, or there's other trainings where you complete online where employees can send you a copy of their completion, or any other tracking system that's electronic. You can use those to keep that documentation, but keep those all in one place where you know where they are, and you can easily go and access records to verify if employees have completed trainings or not. There's also certificates. So certifications and other certificates of training, you can keep those in files and document that information for the records. Some OSHA standards specifically call out the need for documentation of training. And so oftentimes a compliance officer from OSHA, when they come out, that's one of the things they're going to ask for. They're going to see what type of work you do. They're going to see the hazards, and they're going to ask you, can I see some examples of your training rosters, or can I see records of your trainings? So those are things that you're going to want to keep on hand and document those things. I like this phrase, and I've learned this here at the Trust from doing several trainings and working here. The concept of, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. Sometimes it takes documentation to know if something happened, and that's part of training, and keeping those records, showing that employees have been in the class and in the training. That's really important to keep. So keep that in mind with all of your trainings, and keep your documentation there. Like I mentioned, some things require an actual certification. There's certain tasks and certain things that require that. And some standards require that written certification record. So here's an example. Those that operate cranes, there's an actual requirement for crane operators to have a certification. It's through a crane organization, crane training organization. And so you need to keep up on that. If you have somebody operating the crane, they need to have that to be in compliance with OSHA requirements. Same with forklifts, powered industrial trucks. There's a requirement by OSHA to have employees trained in that, with hands-on training, with initial training, and with an evaluation, and every 3 years to maintain that certification. I've got a slide later that will show you that on powered industrial trucks, but that's just a couple of examples of places where, based on the task, there is an actual certification, and you need to keep documentation for that. So these can go into employee files. You can keep them logged in places and keep copies of certifications. It's important that you keep up on all of that. Another thing that's a requirement is each employer should do a hazard analysis of the workplace to look at what type of tasks are being done. And it is the employer's responsibility to do that, to look at the type of work, to look at the specifics of each job task and see what is being done, what hazards are there, and what do I need to train my employees on. It could be lifting injuries. It could be specific types of equipment or tools. It could be any type of process or procedure in the workplace, but anything that involves a hazard, you want to look at that and see, okay, here's what our employees are doing. Here's the training that they need. Here's the requirements for that specific hazard. And I'd recommend you do that for each department in your organizations. When it comes to recommended trainings, these are some of the basic ones that we recommend for all employees. And some of these don't have necessarily a specific frequency, but these are really good topics that apply to most employees, and we recommend you keep a frequency on them. The first one is defensive driving. We recommend this for all drivers, and our recommendation is at least every 2 years on that. Some people do it annually, but at least every 2 years is good, because that's a high risk thing that employees do on a regular basis, is driving around each day, especially those that drive your city vehicles and trucks and places at your organization there. Make sure they're getting the training on that. Harassment and discrimination is another big one. Many organizations do this on an annual basis, and that's excellent to do that. Again, at least every 2 years on that for all employees is our recommendation. Employee orientations, if there's any employee that's new to the job, if there's any specific policies or procedures that have been updated or new process in the workplace, you want to make sure that all of your employees are trained on that. And then some of the top 3 things that cause accidents, we recommend training on preventing strains, lifting and back safety, preventing back injuries, and slip, trip, fall prevention. Those are often the common causes of injuries. And so if you're looking at your organization and what training might be needed, those are some of the key things we would recommend, because they do lead to a lot of accidents and injuries there. So those are some of the recommended ones, not necessarily requirements. There's not OSHA requirements on these specifically, but there are other things that would require training for some of those there. So if we look at the OSHA standards, there's actually a couple of different kinds, and it depends on the type of work you do. So these are the regulation numbers. There's a general industry standard. This is 29 CFR 1910. So if you see anything that says 1910, that's general industry type work. This is basic work for your city, your county, towns, service districts. You got some basic general industry type work there. Now, if you're doing construction work, if you're actually building something or under construction, it falls under a different OSHA standard, and there's different training requirements between these. Some things are different, and actually some things are very similar. There's some real crossover between some of these. But if it says 1926, that's where it's under the construction industry standard. So I'm going to point out some of those today, so you can understand some of the difference and similarities between the two and help identify the requirements. But the question is, how do you identify which OSHA trainings are required? There's a few ways you can do that. You can go to the actual OSHA standards themselves. You can find these on the OSHA's website, osha.gov. You can also type in, if you go to Google, you will find any standard. So if it's respiratory protection, you could just type in OSHA requirements for respiratory protection, and it will often lead you right to that standard. It will have that 1910 regulation there. And another really good way you can do, and we found this online as well, there's actually a document put out by OSHA, which is called Training Requirements in OSHA Standards. And I'll show you a picture of that. It's a document that I've actually looked through to put this presentation together, and it has some really good resources in there. It goes through all the requirements for both general industry and for construction industry, depending on the type of work you're doing. And it helps to identify by standard, by each standard, what the actual requirements are for types of training, who should receive the training, documentation, and frequency, those things that we've talked about today. So I'm going to help you now look at some of these OSHA required trainings and look at the frequency for some of the specifics and some of the most common types of trainings that are required. Now, this doesn't include all types of trainings because it's variable. It depends on the type of work you do. But here are some that really stand out that you want to be aware of. And one of those is having an emergency action plan and training employees to be able to assist in a safe and orderly evacuation of employees. So every organization should have a plan. If there is an emergency, how to handle it, whether it's an earthquake or a fire or an active shooter situation, there should be a plan. And there is a requirement to be training employees on that to help other employees get out and evacuate safely. We've done trainings like this before at a workplace I worked at. And we talked about, what if there's somebody with disabilities? How would you help them get out? What if there's visitors in the building and they don't know where to go? Well, that's what the training is for, to help and train on those. So I would recommend that you do that. There's not a specific frequency on this training, but at least initially all employees should be trained on that. And then you can determine your frequency that's needed to keep employees aware and trained on the emergency action plans. And then another one here is occupational noise exposure. So employees that are exposed to high levels of noise, 85 decibels or more for 8 hours a day on average, they need to be trained. And so the employer, here's the regulation 1910.95. This is where the employee shall provide training in the use and care of all hearing protectors provided to the employees. So if it's earmuffs or earplugs, whatever the protection is, there is a requirement to train the employee on that. Bloodborne pathogens is another. This is another big one that many organizations do. And this one is actually required at initial training and also annually. And this is for employees that have an anticipated exposure. So if in the workplace, an occupational exposure where they're likely to come in contact with blood or fluids that could be carrying a bloodborne pathogen, then they need to have this training, and it is an annual requirement to keep that up. There is a requirement in there that specifically says the need to document the training. And so that's where you want to keep your rosters and your documentations for things like that. So anybody that's assigned to administer first aid or CPR, those that work at swimming pools or, recreation centers, places where you might have somebody that could have a real accident and have blood on their hands or have fluids, those are where you need to have your training for that. And at least annually for a refresher on that. First aid and CPR, this is subpart K of the OSHA standard, and it's under the section of medical services and first aid. And the requirement here is that you provide training in the absence of an infirmary, clinic, or hospital in near proximity. Now in the standard, it will tell you kind of what that range is, but if it takes a long time to get to a hospital, if you're kind of out in the open and not near any clinic or anything like that, then there is a requirement to provide that training to your employees and have somebody trained in first aid and CPR on the job site. So look at where you are, look at how far you are from a clinic or hospital, and that can help to determine that. First aid and CPR is something that a lot of organizations do. It's very common. They often do it every 2 years to keep their certifications up, but that's something you want to look at for the needs for your organization there. Hazard communication, this is another big one. This is something for all workplaces where there are hazardous chemicals, and I would say that's the majority of all workplaces. There's usually some kind of hazardous chemicals there, whether it's in janitorial closets or in the workplace themselves or the processes they use. This is a requirement that's there, and this is one of the most common cited things that OSHA has is on hazard communication. So there is a requirement that the employers train the employees on what the chemicals are in the workplace and train them on how to properly store them, how to handle them, and how to find information on these types of things. You can find this information on the safety data sheets, and employees need to be trained on how to access those and find those in the workplace and the right way to handle these different chemicals. So that's one of the biggest trainings. There's not an actual frequency on this for training. Definitely at start of a job, or if there's a new process starting up with new chemicals, you definitely want to train on that. But it's a good recommendation to keep up on this because this is something that OSHA will look for. Personal protective equipment is another required training, and the actual standard says that you should train employees on when PPE is necessary, when to wear it, what kind is necessary, how to properly wear it, how to put it on and take it off, how to store it, how to care for it, and the limitations of it with the PPE that they can wear. So proper care, maintenance, and disposal when it's used up and time to replace. So that goes for all personal protective equipment. You can see a picture here of many examples, but definitely need to provide training on that to all of your employees. Another OSHA standard out there that requires training is respiratory protection. We actually have another webinar on this, and we do on several of these topics. But this webinar we have goes into further detail on the different training requirements and what's needed to keep in compliance with this. But this standard requires the employer to provide effective training to employees who are required to use respirators. So that involves several parts of training: how to wear it, how to use it, the limitations, information about the cartridges and things like that to use. Like I say, we do have more information on these, but that's just pointing out that there is a requirement for that training. HAZWOPER is another one. What this stands for is Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response. So employees that are working with hazardous waste, they need to be trained. There's a requirement for that. And there's a couple of options for that. There's a 24-hour training requirement and a 40-hour training requirement. And to determine which one of those you're going to train on and what's required, it's based on the anticipated exposure of the employee and how long they're exposed to that for. So that's your PEL there, which stands for permissible exposure limit. And that's what you want to verify. How often are they going to be working? What's the exposure? And that will determine if it's a 24 or a 40-hour training. And the requirement with this one, there is actually an annual refresher on this one. So it's an initial training before they're exposed to this hazardous waste. And then every year there's an 8-hour refresher training requirement to keep up on that. So we can help you with more information on that as well. We do trainings as well for this one on the refreshers too. So lots of options there. Powered industrial trucks is another one. This is where your forklifts, your lifts that you use in the workplace. There's a requirement for each operator to be trained and authorized to use the forklift. Now, the key with this one is it's every 3 years. So after the employer authorizes them, they do some training, they do a hands-on training and an evaluation. And after that, every 3 years, they have to keep up on that. So this training should be specific to the exact type of equipment they're using, the exact model. So that's where your hands-on training will come in. There will be some classroom training, which involves the general requirements and how to work safely around those. And then at least every 3 years, that evaluation and follow-up training for refresher to keep them current and operating their forklifts in compliance. This is another thing that OSHA will check for when they come out to the site. We often see them ask for these records just to verify that your forklift operators are trained and authorized to use that. Another example is powered platforms and man lifts. Now, this isn't necessarily a man lift, but I love the picture because they're lifting up men on these forks, which they're not supposed to do. A forklift is not necessarily a man lift, but any employee that does operate a man lift or a powered platform, they're supposed to be trained on how to operate it safely and how to use it. Now, examples of this are aerial lifts or bucket trucks or any type of man lift that's powered that goes up and down to get work done. Lockout, tagout is another big one. This is where there's the control of hazardous energy. So it could be those that work around any type of energy. It could be electrical, it could be stored energy, any type of pressure, anything that's energized in the workplace, there needs to be training. And it needs to be for both the authorized and the affected employees. That's what OSHA calls it in their standards. So the authorized employee is the one that's actually working on the system. They're locking it out, they're tagging it out, they're doing maintenance and service on it. They are the one that's trained and authorized to do it. And then the affected employee or the other employees are in the workplace that are affected by de-energizing a system. So they could be working near the area, they could be working in the system, but they're not necessarily the one that's locking it out and tagging it out. So both authorized and affected employees need to be trained on the energy control procedure to adequately lock out and tag out equipment so it doesn't become energized by accident. And then toxic and hazardous substances. This is another example. So if you have employees working with asbestos or lead or any other type of hazardous substance, there's some specific trainings for that. And that's based on the task, based on the job. So if they're doing demolition work in an older building, you might want to consider looking into the requirements for that to see what is required to be in compliance there. And there's several other examples as well on those types of hazardous substances. Another big training, and this is one that we do each year, is confined space entry. This is one of the most hazardous tasks. And there's a standard on it for permit required confined spaces where knowledge and skills necessary for the safe performance of the duties assigned. There needs to be training on that to make sure that employees have that knowledge and skill to be able to do it safely. This is a training that's required before employees work in or around confined spaces. There's not an actual refresher training on that. There's not a frequency to it, but we would recommend doing this frequently because it is one of the most hazardous things that are out there. That's why we provide this each year. We actually do a regional training on this, which we have coming up later this year because it is one of the most dangerous things out there. And so you want to look at your employees, see who's working around confined spaces. And before they go in or work around these, they do need to have that training so they know what to expect and how to keep themselves safe. Another big one is fall protection. This is from the construction industry. You'll see the 1926 there. This is where you need to have a training program for each employee who might be exposed to fall hazards. So there's lots of different types of systems to prevent employees from falls. The picture here is an example of a personal fall arrest system. Employees need to be trained on each type and each kind so they know how to prevent that fall and how to protect themselves. Could be a guardrail system, could be a restraint system, whichever one it is. There needs to be training, and I would recommend training regularly, especially if they're working at height, exposed to a fall hazard. This is one of the most common causes of injuries in the workplace. It's one of the most common cited things from OSHA. So you definitely want to have training on fall protection. Employees working on scaffolds. This is another example. If you have employees working up there, there's training for each employee who's going to work on it. There's also training for the person who sets up and erects the scaffold. They have a specific training requirement for them as well. I know a lot of you may not work on scaffolds, but if you do have somebody, there does need to be a competent person available that's trained, and that employees are trained while working on it. Trenching and excavation safety is another big topic. We also provide this training each year in our regional trainings. We have another coming up on that. And there's a requirement for that competent person to be trained. In the standard, it will call that out. That competent person is somebody who oversees the work and makes sure that other employees are safe and doing the right things. And so they actually have to have that training. There is not actually in the standard any wording that says that employees have to be trained on this. However, I would recommend that all employees do that because it is high hazard work, and there can be fatalities from it. It's a dangerous task. So it is something I recommend you train on regularly with your employees. But that competent person needs to be able to identify the hazards. They need to have that authority to take action and keep employees safe. So that's why they need to have that specific training for that there. So again, not a specific frequency on that, but I would always do that for your employees and keep it regular to keep them safe on the work there. So that's an overview of many of the OSHA standard requirements and some of the specifics that they have. I know that can be a lot to think about, and so I just wanted to point out that we are here to help. The Trust provides lots of different trainings. We have many different training options, and that's what we can do to help you and help identify what trainings you need and how often to do those with more specifics. So we do have our website. Jason's mentioned this earlier. We have our YouTube channel where we record and put up our monthly webinars. You can go there, and those trainings that I just talked about, all that list of those, they are on there. We have webinars for those. We also do in-class trainings, like I mentioned, the regional trainings, and we have several online options as well, which I know a lot of you have already heard about. There's a couple of online vendors as well where things are available to get further training. So we are here to help, to identify what you need. We are here to help train on those. That's part of our job, to make your jobs easier that way. So I just wanted to summarize what we've talked about today. There's kind of an overview of the process of keeping your trainings effective. One thing you need to do is identify which required trainings there are. What do your employees need? What's happening in your organization to identify those types of trainings, and then identify what is the schedule and frequency for each one of those. You can use that training matrix to track and schedule those things out each year, and then determine, once you determine what your kind of trainings are, determine what the best method is. What's the best way I want to do this? Do I want an instructor to come in? Do I need that qualified person? Is online okay? Help to determine which is best, and then track it. Track that training, keep the documentation, keep all of your rosters. That will help your training programs become more effective as you follow it through and schedule and track those things. And that's the goal, and that's the training for today. Jason, do we have any questions out there?
Yeah, we do have some questions, but I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions, to go ahead and type those into the chat box, and we'll answer those right at this point. We had a question on training rosters. What information needs to be included on a training roster?
Great question. So training roster, you should at least have the topic, the date that the training was done. I would recommend having the times on there so you know what time they were doing the training. Have a list of employees, have a list of the name of the instructor so you know who actually did it, and even the location. The location of where that training was held is great for documentation there. Those are some of the basics and minimum things.
Yeah, so that's kind of the bare minimum there, Brent. Then if somebody wanted to add a printout of what the slides were they went through, or maybe if it were a video that they watched, to put the specifics where it came from, things like that.
Yeah, that'd be great too. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, anything that helps identify it.
I have to share a story at this point.
Okay, go for it.
At one point in my career, we had an incident. Unfortunately, it was a serious accident, and and OSHA was involved, and we got a citation after that. And they gave us a citation on training. And we really disagreed with that. We went to an informal conference with OSHA on this specific situation, and they said, well, hey, the employee said you hadn't given him any training on this, and he was involved in the accident. I said, no, we really disagree with that. We did do training. And anyway, it was just so good to have that training, all of those records available. We showed what the training was. We had the employee's signature on the rosters for the various different trainings, and it totally changed the day there. But this particular employee somehow forgot that he'd had the training on the specifics of how to avoid this injury. And anyway, so that's the reason why you want to do that. Some other questions. Let's see. So retraining on that, the point was the point basically on retraining is not all of these standards have a retraining requirement,
Right.
but we should be doing it when it makes sense.
Yeah, definitely, especially if it's high hazard or high risk or something they're doing regularly, like a confined space work. There's not an actual frequency to that that's required, but given the nature of that work, you're definitely going to want to retrain and make sure your employees are up to speed on things like that. So it depends on the hazard, depends on the type of work.
And if things change in the work,
things change, yeah. If anything changes, you add in a new process, new procedure, you want to retrain and make sure people are up on that.
Great. And training methods, people can do it in a lot of different ways, right? It doesn't have to be done one specific way. Sit down and look at a PowerPoint slide, or
there's many ways to do it, and some may be more effective than others. Some, you may want that in-person training given the hazard or the severity of what the training is and what they're working around. So some online options are great. Some are great to keep it simple. Others you want to have more comprehensive, and you may even want to have a specialized trainer for some of those to address those specifics.
Awesome.
Depends on the type of training you're looking for and the type of work being done.
Looks like those are the questions that we have. I just want to, you brought up that we've got regional training coming up. We've got it scheduled. We've got it on the calendar. We're just kind of crossing our fingers that things go well with COVID. We'll be sending out announcements for that. We're looking at November for defensive driving training, December for confined space and trenching, and January for harassment and discrimination prevention. So we're crossing our fingers that our numbers come down and that we can get together in decent sized groups and make that happen. But keep your ear to the ground on that and watch for those announcements as they come out. Brent, final word.
That's it, everybody. Everybody stay safe. Make sure you're all trained, and that's what can prevent accidents, just sometimes knowing and being aware. So stay safe and keep your training up. Thanks.